The disappearance of Céline Feghart. A young French woman embarked on a journey to Britain to visit her relatives for Christmas, but she mysteriously disappeared along the way. Authorities swiftly launched an extensive search, and the case quickly gained widespread media attention in both France and the UK. As investigators followed a series of clues, they inched closer to uncovering the truth, only to find something far more disturbing than they had anticipated. Céline Feghart was born on May 23, 1976, in Besançon, a quiet and picturesque town near the Swiss border in France. Céline was raised in a warm and caring household alongside her parents, 2 brothers and a sister. Her father worked as a farmer, and she and her siblings often spent their time outdoors, assisting him in maintaining the farm. At school, Céline was an active student, excelling in sports and forming strong friendships. When she was 14, her parents took her on a trip to Britain, a place she immediately fell in love with. From that moment on, she dreamed of one day making it her home. Motivated by her cousin, who worked as a hotel manager in the UK, Céline chose to pursue an education that would prepare her for a career in the hospitality industry. After completing school, she enrolled in a local university to study accounting while continuing to visit her cousin in England whenever she had the chance. One summer, he helped her secure a job at a hotel, allowing her to gain hands-on experience before eventually returning home. In late 1995, at the age of 19, Céline made plans to visit Britain once again for the Christmas holiday. During that time, public train services in France were facing disruptions, prompting her parents to seek alternative travel arrangements. They reached out to a family friend, a truck driver, who agreed to give Céline a ride to Folkestone while delivering cargo to England. From there, she intended to continue her journey to Fordingbridge, a town approximately 150 miles, 250 kilometers away, where her cousin lived. On December 18th, Céline set off, expecting to reach her cousin's hotel by the evening. Her parents waited for her call to confirm she had arrived safely. But as the night wore on, there was no word from her. Without a mobile phone, Céline's family had no way to contact her and could only wait, hoping she would eventually arrive at the hotel. That night, they finally received a call, but it wasn't from Céline. Instead, it was her cousin, who informed them that she still hadn't shown up and asked if her plans had changed. Growing increasingly anxious, her parents, left with no other options, decided to reach out to the police. French authorities immediately contacted their British counterparts, who wasted no time in launching a search for the missing young woman. The first step in the investigation was speaking with Céline's parents, who traveled to England to assist with the case. They informed the police about the family friend, a truck driver, who had offered Céline a ride to the UK. Investigators managed to track him down, and he confirmed that he had dropped her off in Folkestone before heading in a different direction. While at the truck stop, he had encountered another French trucker who was traveling to Newbury, a town roughly an hour's drive from Céline's cousin's hotel. The second driver agreed to give Céline a ride, and investigators were able to track him down as well. He informed the police that he had dropped her off at a truck stop in Newbury. While there, she attempted to use a payphone to contact her cousin and arrange for a pickup, but for some unknown reason, she was unable to get through. By that point, it was already 4:30 p.m. The driver suggested that she take a train to her cousin's town, but there was a complication. The nearest train station was several dozen miles away, and he couldn't drive her there since his delivery route took him in a different direction. Wanting to assist her, he began asking other truckers in the parking lot if anyone could offer Céline a ride. The first trucker he approached declined, explaining that he planned to rest before continuing his journey. However, the second trucker agreed, mentioning that he was heading to Salisbury, which was only about a 30-minute drive from Céline's cousin's town. He even mentioned she could probably catch an 8 p.m. bus from there. With no other options left, Céline went with the third driver, and that's where her trail disappeared. Detectives tried to track this man down, but they didn't have enough solid information to identify him. The second driver, who had handed her over, couldn't recall the license plate number and only remembered that the truck was a white Mercedes. He also provided a description of the man. He was around 35 years old, had short blonde hair and a beard, The second driver also mentioned that something about this man struck him as suspicious. There was something unsettling about his behavior, but he still let Celine go with him because, at that point, she simply had no other choice. Police began to suspect that the third driver might have been involved in Celine's disappearance. Using the witness's description, they created a composite sketch and shared it with the local media. As for the first two drivers, investigators thoroughly checked their alibis and found solid evidence proving they had been in other locations at the time. Detectives soon uncovered a troubling detail that made them even more suspicious of the third driver. Remember how he told Celine she could catch an evening bus to her cousin's town from Salisbury? Well, it turned out that no such bus existed. Investigators wasted no time getting the word out about they shared her story, along with the suspect's composite sketch, through newspapers and TV. The case quickly grabbed national attention in both Britain and France. It was just days before Christmas, and the disappearance of a young woman during the holiday season struck a chord with the public. On top of that, there were fears that Celine might have fallen victim to a serial killer. Over the past 2 years, several young women had been murdered in the same area. Police believed these cases were linked to a single perpetrator, and now they were worried Celine's disappearance could be connected to him. As a result, the local police launched a full-scale search. Over 100 officers were assigned to the case, along with helicopters and even an airplane to scan the area from above. They concentrated their efforts along the route the third driver was believed to have taken with Celine, but despite all their efforts, they found no trace of her. Unfortunately, the first week of the search yielded no results. Both the police and Celine's family made numerous public appeals, urging anyone who might know something about her whereabouts or the driver himself to come forward. But every lead they followed quickly turned into a dead end. This went on for over a week, until the morning of December 29th, when police received a chilling call. A man driving near the town of Worcester had pulled over to adjust his windshield wipers. While walking along the roadside, he noticed something odd partially covered by snow. Curious, he went closer and, to his horror, realized it was a human body. Shaken, he immediately rushed home and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and found the body of a young woman, but at first, they couldn't identify her. Initially, they thought it might be the remains of a local woman who had disappeared after leaving a nightclub, but the theory was quickly ruled out. It wasn't until the following day, December 30th, that police confirmed the body was Celine's. Her cousin was brought in to identify her, sparing her parents the heartbreaking task of doing it themselves. Police quickly noticed one important detail. The highway where Celine's body was found was almost in the opposite direction of where she had been heading. This only strengthened their theory that the truck driver who had given her a ride was likely responsible for her murder. All of Celine's clothing and personal belongings were missing, and officers found no trace of them near the site where her body was discovered. The autopsy revealed multiple bruises and abrasions consistent with heavy blows, as well as evidence of strangulation. Medical examiners also found signs of SA on Celine's body, but there was no biological material that could lead them to the perpetrator. One chilling detail stood out. The examiners determined that Celine's body had likely been left by the roadside only about 24 hours before it was found. With 11 days having passed since her disappearance, detectives speculated that the killer may have kept her alive for most of that time or even transported her body with him. The second driver who had helped Celine mentioned that the suspect's truck was equipped with an industrial freezer, which suggested the killer could have preserved her body at low temperatures for days. Despite all this, the police still had no solid leads on the driver's identity. However, a conversation with Celine's parents revealed an intriguing detail. She had been carrying 2 bottles of champagne as Christmas gifts. These, along with all her other belongings, were never found. It seemed likely that the killer had taken them, which gave investigators a potential new angle to explore. This champagne was a specific French brand that wasn't sold in Britain, making those 2 bottles completely unique in the country. Police decided to use this as leverage and sent information about the bottles to the media, along with photos of identical champagne. They hoped that the perpetrator might have shown them to someone or even shared them with friends or family. But unfortunately, this lead also went nowhere. Without any other leads in hand, investigators decided to take an unprecedented step. Despite the absence of the perpetrator's DNA on the victim's body, in early January of the following year, they initiated the first mass DNA collection in Britain's history. The police focused their efforts on drivers of Mercedes trucks and similar models. This process took over a month, and detectives managed to test more than 5,000 drivers. Most of them willingly provided their samples, but there were some who refused. Investigators put them on a separate list for further scrutiny, thinking that one of those individuals might be the killer. Meanwhile, Celine's case continued to gain widespread attention in both British and French media. The police received thousands of tips and leads, but unfortunately, none of them brought the detectives any closer to catching the killer. This continued until mid-February when one tip finally caught the investigators' attention. A man called the police after seeing the suspect's sketch on the news and said it looked strikingly similar to one of his co-workers, a 36-year-old truck driver named Stuart Little. He also mentioned that Stuart drove a Mercedes truck with a refrigeration unit. This lead prompted detectives to start digging into Stuart's background. The first thing they uncovered was Stuart's extensive criminal history, though it consisted of non-violent offenses. Next, they decided to approach him carefully and ask for a DNA sample, presenting it as a routine part of their investigation involving thousands of drivers across Britain. However, Stuart refused to provide a sample, which only deepened their suspicions. After several more attempts to persuade him, though, Stuart eventually gave in and agreed to the test. As soon as they had his DNA, the police secured a warrant to search his truck. That's when they found their first major evidence: traces of blood on the mattress in the sleeping area and in other parts of the cab. Testing confirmed it was Celine's blood, and that was enough for an arrest. The police also obtained a warrant to search Stuart's house. In his garage, they discovered Celine's personal belongings, the ones she had with her when she disappeared. But that wasn't all. Investigators noticed something odd about Stuart's tachograph, the device truck drivers are required to use by law to track their driving hours. It appeared that on the day Celine's body was dumped, Stuart had deliberately sealed information about his movements. However, he made a mistake. After disposing of the body, he resumed work without filling in the missing data. This created a suspicious gap in his driving log, which detectives believed corresponded to the time he transported Celine's body to the roadside. During his first interrogation, Stuart denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he had never even picked up Celine. But when police brought in the other driver, who identified Stuart in a lineup, his story changed. He now admitted to giving Celine a ride and claimed they had consensual intercourse. As for her belongings found in his garage, Stuart insisted she had simply forgotten them when he dropped her off. Naturally, investigators weren't quick to believe Stuart's story. They continued searching for evidence and soon found a witness who had seen him the day before Celine's body was discovered. The witness spotted Stuart near a warehouse about 50 miles from where the body was found. He was seen starting a fire next to his truck, and it appeared he was burning something. When police confronted Stuart about this, he claimed he'd started the fire to warm up his truck brakes, which had supposedly frozen due to the weather. Officers decided to search the area near the warehouse, and it didn't take long for them to find something disturbing. Underneath a fence, they discovered Celine's underwear. It was stained with her blood. Piecing together all the evidence, investigators came up with the most likely timeline of events. When Stuart picked up Celine, he drove to a secluded area where he assaulted and killed her. Based on the blood evidence found in his truck, they believe Stuart kept her body on the lower bunk in his cab for 10 days while continuing to make deliveries as if nothing had happened. Shockingly, just a week after the murder, Stuart went home to celebrate Christmas with his wife and children, while Celine's body remained just a few yards away in his truck. At some point, he decided to dispose of the body. Investigators found receipts showing Stuart had purchased a shovel, an axe, and a saw, likely with the intention of dismembering her remains. However, for some reason, he abandoned that plan and simply left her body near the roadside. Detectives soon uncovered another chilling detail. The day after Christmas, Stuart gave those 2 bottles of rare French champagne to an acquaintance as a gift. When detectives questioned him about it, Stuart claimed he bought the bottles from another French truck driver, but investigators didn't believe a word of it. On top of that, they uncovered another intriguing detail. Stewart had always worn a beard, but he completely shaved it off after the murder, right around the time the suspect sketch started appearing in the news. They also figured out why Celine couldn't reach her cousin when she tried to call him from a payphone. It turned out that the UK had recently changed its phone codes, and Celine had his number written down with the old code in her notebook. Unaware of this update, she dialed the outdated number, and her call never went through. For Stewart's family, friends, and co-workers, these revelations were a complete shock. To them, he had always seemed like a devoted family man and a reliable friend. At first, many even refused to believe he could have been involved. But as the media revealed the mounting evidence against him, they had no choice but to face the horrifying truth of who Stewart really was. Stewart's trial began in October of that year, and despite the mountain of evidence against him, he stuck to his story, denying everything. But the jury didn't need long to deliberate. They unanimously found him guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving at least 20 years. Soon after his sentencing, Stewart tried to appeal the verdict, claiming that the high-profile nature of the case had biased the jury, preventing him from receiving a fair trial. However, the appeals court rejected his claims. In February 2006, Stewart made another attempt to have his sentence reviewed, but once again, his appeal was denied. 10 years later, in February 2016, Stewart became eligible for parole, but his request was denied. The reason was clear. Even after spending 2 decades in prison, he still refused to admit to the crime and maintained his innocence. The judge also expressed concerns that Stewart continues to pose a threat to society. At present, he remains incarcerated, with little possibility of release in the near future. It is worth noting that Stewart was ultimately ruled out as a suspect in the other murders previously mentioned. Those crimes were later attributed to a different truck driver, who was apprehended in late 1997. Although prosecutors officially linked him to only 2 murders, they suspect he may be responsible for several other unsolved cases. Regarding Stewart, investigators also theorized that Celine might not have been his only victim. However, despite the passage of time, no concrete evidence has surfaced to tie him to any additional crimes. Feel free to share your thoughts on this case in the comments section. Moving on to the next case. Kimberly Killer. On the morning of January 12, 1999, a woman's nearly beheaded body was discovered inside a car in Council Bluffs, Iowa. She was identified as Kimberly, and investigators determined that she had died 4 and 6 hours before being found. Authorities collected her clothing and other items from the crime scene, hoping that advancements in forensic science would eventually help identify the person responsible. In 2014, with improved DNA testing techniques, investigators submitted the evidence to the Iowa State Lab for analysis. By 2017, forensic officials informed law enforcement that they had discovered an unknown male DNA profile on an item of a personal nature, one that only Kimberly and her attacker would have had contact with. In August 2020, investigators compiled a list of 6 men who may have been in contact with Kimberly in the final hours of her life. The DNA from these individuals was compared to the unknown male profile found at the scene. The results revealed a match to 52-year-old Matt W. Kennedy, a resident of Fairfield, Montana, who had previously lived in Council Bluffs. Matt was not only Kimberly's stepbrother, but also the last known person to have seen her alive. In October 2020, investigators received further confirmation when the DNA, found on an item that the suspect likely handled during the attack, also matched Matt Kennedy. He was arrested in mid-October 2020, bringing an end to a decades-long search for Kimberly's killer. Moving on to the next case. The Chun family tragedy. On the afternoon of October 8, 2014, a co-worker of 39-year-old Gene Jifing grew worried when the father of 2 failed to show up for his scheduled shift at King's Walk, a restaurant where he worked. He hadn't called in sick either, which was unusual. Concerned, the co-worker decided to check on Chan at his home on Western Avenue in the Guilderland suburb of Albany, New York. What he discovered inside was a horrific crime scene. Chan and his 38-year-old wife, Hai Yilin, were originally from Huaiyu, China. The couple had moved to the United States in the early 2000s, settling in Guilderland near a takeout restaurant owned by relatives. There, they built a life together and had 2 children, 10-year-old Anthony and 7-year-old Eddie. By all accounts, the Chin family was ordinary, with nothing unusual about their lives, making their brutal murders all the more puzzling to investigators. The case gained significant attention, as it was the first quadruple homicide in the Capital District. According to Chen's brother, who spoke to the media, the father of 2 was found on the ground floor of the family's bungalow. Hai and the couple's 2 children were discovered upstairs, their bodies covered by a blanket. The family had met a brutal end. Each of them had been bludgeoned with a hammer, and later reports indicated they had also been stabbed. Investigators determined the murders took place in the early morning hours, likely between 3:30 and 6:30 a.m. Both the Guilderland and New York State Police worked together on the case, searching the areas surrounding the family's home for any possible clues. Authorities faced several challenges in the initial 48 hours of the investigation. A language barrier slowed progress, and fear within the community made gathering information difficult. Further complicating matters, there were no surveillance cameras in the area, and Apple initially refused to release the Chen's iPhone records. Though the company eventually complied, law enforcement stated that the delays significantly hindered their investigation. With little physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, detectives have struggled to make progress. Some DNA samples were collected and may belong to a suspect, but so far, no matches have been found. As a result, authorities have few leads and no major suspects in the case. Before long, allegations surfaced that the family were involved in shady business practices and illegal activities such as human trafficking, gambling, and money laundering. Chen's brother denied rumors that the family had been attacked by someone who'd returned to the house after a gambling party to steal their sizable take from the been living comfortably ever since, causing people to think that he was making money illegally. This same source alleged that Hai was in the country illegally too. Meanwhile, an article by the Times-Union reported that Chan had supposedly been involved in large transfers of unrecorded cash, which he used to pay undocumented Chinese workers at restaurants in New York City. He reportedly also transported the workers to their jobs and back and provided accommodation in cities that were too far away for bus trips. Even more damningly, 18 mattresses were found on the basement floor of the family's home. The Times-Union also claimed that the weekly card game Chin ran had racked up about $100,000 in debt. However, this is where that lead dries up. Authorities have said that while the organized crime theory hasn't been discounted, they have yet to find any solid leads in the case. The only other theory explored in the case was a possible connection between the Chin family murders and 2 other family killings that occurred around the same time. In 2014, a family of 4 was shot and killed in their Houston, Texas home. Similarly, in 2011, a married couple and the wife's sister were found stabbed to death in their Mississippi residence. However, no definitive links have been established between these crimes. By 2015, investigators had pursued 600 leads, a surprisingly low number for such a serious case. A reporter from World Journal suggested that she and her colleagues suspected the family may have known more than they disclosed. The Chan's funeral took place a month after their deaths to allow time for relatives from overseas to attend. They were laid to rest at All Faith Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens. The case remains unsolved, and a $5,000 reward is still being offered for information leading to an arrest. Anyone with knowledge of the Chin family murders is encouraged to report it at capitalregionalcrimestoppers.com. // capitalregionalcrimestoppers.com. Moving on to the next case. Reynosa girls case. In February 2019, Spain ranked as the 2nd most visited country in the world, welcoming an astonishing 83,700,000 tourists. Visitors flock to experience its rich culture, admire its breathtaking landscapes, and unwind on its scenic beaches. While Spain is generally considered a safe destination, with crime rates lower than in many other European nations, it is not without its darker side. Among its unsettling mysteries are the disappearances of Manuela Bugifa and Virginia S. Bajo. On an April afternoon, 14-year-old Virginia S. Pedro asked her mother for money, saying she needed it to buy a birthday cake for a party she planned to attend. However, Virginia never showed up at the celebration she had mentioned. Instead, she secretly met up with her close friend, 13-year-old Manuela Bajifa. The two girls boarded a train to Reynosa, a town about 18 miles from where they lived, intending to visit a nightclub. Knowing their parents would disapprove, they deliberately kept their plans hidden. The girls had invited a third friend to join them, but she, declined and chose to stay home instead. Around 9 p.m., Virginia and Manuela left the nightclub and began their journey back. Investigators later determined that the girls had likely resorted to hitchhiking after realizing there were no trains running at that hour. A witness, who happened to be from their hometown, was the last person to see them. She was unable to offer them a ride since her car was already full. But she later told authorities that she saw the girls getting into a white Seat 127 with a Valladolid license plate near the town's main street. Manuela and Virginia were never seen again. However, there was no evidence suggesting they had intended to run away. They had very little money on them and were only dressed in the clothes they had worn that day. Nothing was missing from their bedrooms at home. As time passed with no sign of the girls, their worried families reported them missing to the Civil Guard. However, they were met with resistance from the officers. In 1992, the protocols for missing children were not as strict or immediate as they are today. The families of Manuela and Virginia were told they need to wait 48 hours before a search could be launched. This would later cause the civil guards to receive criticism and backlash, as it's understood that the first 24 hours after an individual goes missing are the most vital. Virginia's sister recalled being told by an agent they have gone to a party. They will come back whenever they want. During the early 1990s, a Spanish journalist named Paco Lobarton presented the public service program Who Knows Where, which is similar to the BBC's Crime Watch program in the UK. Viewers could phone into the show with tips and information about unsolved cases, with Who Knows Where focusing specifically on missing person cases. The show aired an episode about Manuela and Virginia, and it received dozens of calls as a result. Alleged sightings placed the girls all over Spain, while other callers appeared to be unwell. Cruel hoaxers who said they would bring harm to the girls and that their parents would never see them alive again. Family members traveled as far as Asturias to see if they could track down their missing loved ones, but instead were met with young girls who bore a resemblance to the pair. No trace of the real Manuela and Virginia was ever found. In October of 1994, a group of friends walking near the Rey K. Hardar Reservoir, about 25 miles from where the girls were last seen, found two skulls. Two members of the group were writers for a newspaper that published their findings without analysis or forewarning the families claiming the skulls could possibly belong to the two missing girls. The lead after all that turned out to be a dead end. The skulls did not belong to Manuela and Virginia. They were too old, believed to date back to the 1930s. 3 years later, in 1997, a witness claimed that the girls were in Madrid with what he described as a punk community. He alleged that Manuela had cut her hair short and dyed it blue with one small white section. Investigators put together composite images of the girls and how they may have looked in 1997. But when they finally located the women the witness had described, it was discovered they were not, in fact, Manuela and Virginia. In February 2001, 2 more skulls were discovered, but they were determined to belong to victims of the Civil War. Furthermore, in February 2018, a human jawbone was found in a reservoir in Cantabria, but it did not belong to the missing girls. Then in 2021, new hope came for the families of Manuela and Virginia when a woman called into a TV program about unsolved cases to tell them that 1 year before the girls went missing, she and one of her friends had suffered an attempted kidnapping. After alerting the TV show, the woman gave a statement to the Civil Guard, which led to a new line of inquiry being investigated. The woman and her friend had struggled with the driver, causing him to veer off the side of the road. She and her friend then took the opportunity to flee. The details of the case were chillingly similar to that of Manuela and Virginia. The two women had been hitchhiking and had been picked up by someone in a white Seat 127. More hopeful still, the witness was able to identify the man driving the vehicle, and he became a suspect in the case. He had a criminal record which included being arrested 4 times for attempted sexual assault. Another suspect came to light around this time, but law enforcement never recovered a photograph of him from 1992. The suspect was described as a young man between the ages of 20 and 25 in 1992. Investigators discovered that he had temporarily left the country in August of that same year. When questioned by authorities, he gave conflicting statements. At first, he denied knowing the girls, but later admitted during an interview with the civil guard that a friend had introduced him to them at the nightclub. However, he insisted that he never saw them again after that brief encounter. Over the years, multiple claims have surfaced suggesting that the remains of Manuela and Virginia may be hidden in the Fonteria mine. An anonymous tipster had alerted police to this possibility early in the investigation. Although their bodies were not found at the time, authorities noted that a thick layer of mud obscured visibility to the bottom of the mine. Additionally, the nearby Cerveda cave has never been searched, despite the civil guard stating in 1993 that it would be an ideal location to conceal bodies. In 2021, the civil guard reopened the case, but even now, Manuela, Virginia, and their families are still awaiting justice. Ruth's murder. In the Midwestern state of Ohio sits Columbus, a city with a population of over 905,000 and a history filled with some of true crime's most perplexing mysteries. While cases like the strange disappearance of medical student Brian Schaefer have gained widespread attention, today's focus is on a lesser-known tragedy. In 1950, Ruth King met and fell in love with Russell Alter, a railroad fireman with a strong reputation despite having been divorced twice. Deputy Sheriff Clyde Murray later spoke highly of Russell, describing him as having a #1 record and calling him one of the city's most upstanding men. That Christmas Eve, Ruth and Russell were married, and by February 1951, they moved from Russell's parents' property into their newly purchased home at 350 North Sylvan Avenue in the Hilltop neighborhood. 2 months later, on April 8, Ruth, then 32, gave birth to their first child, a son named Clarence Frederick. For just over 2 weeks, the couple embraced life as new parents, completely devoted to their newborn. However, their happiness was shattered on April 25 when Russell returned home to a devastating scene. Ruth was dead. That morning, at approximately 5:30 a.m., Russell kissed his wife goodbye and left for work. At 39 years old, he was balancing 2 jobs, leaving him away from home for long hours. Russell worked full-time for the Pennsylvania Railroad but also had a part-time job as a motorcycle escort for funerals with the special deputies. Ruth was confirmed to be alive at 8:35 a.m. when Clyde Murray, who was reported in newspapers as overseeing the special deputies, called the couple's home to speak with Russell. Ruth answered and explained that her husband had been called in for a shift at the Pennsylvania Railroad at 5 a.m. and wouldn't be back until around 3 o'clock or 3:30 that afternoon. Clyde had called regarding a funeral scheduled for later that day, but after realizing what happened to Ruth after this conversation remains unknown. Meanwhile, Russell finished his shift around 3 p.m. and decided to visit his mother, Stella Drogon, and his stepfather, H. The three spent time together, catching up and sharing a meal. Since H. Dorgan had been in poor health, he had yet to see the couple's new home or meet their newborn son. After dinner, Russell invited his parents to visit the house on North Sylvan Avenue. Before heading to the store, he wanted to check in with Ruth to see if she needed anything. So the 3 of them made their way to his home. Around 6 p.m., upon arriving at their home, Russell immediately noticed that the door was unlocked. This struck him as unusual since he had made sure to lock it before leaving that morning. But it wasn't enough to raise immediate concern. He ushered his parents inside and followed them in. It was his mother, Stella, who made the horrifying discovery. In the doorway where the kitchen met the living room, she found Ruth's lifeless body. The scene was nothing short of a bloodbath. Blood was splattered across nearly every surface: the stove, refrigerator, trash bins, back door, kitchen table, walls, and even the ceiling. Ruth had met an incredibly violent end. She was still dressed in her slip and dress and gown, suggesting she had been attacked inside her home. Officers responding to the scene later recalled Stella's stunned reaction, as she reportedly gasped, "Oh my God, she's had a hemorrhage." However, the truth was far more sinister. Ruth had been brutally beaten almost beyond recognition. Investigators suspected that the murder weapon was a loafer-style shoe, which belonged to her husband. Russell had left Ruth's body just inside the living room doorway. Nearby, officers discovered the suspected murder weapon, a loafer-style shoe that appeared to have been cleaned in an attempt to remove evidence. However, the heel of the shoe was missing and was never found. Investigators noted that the puncture wounds on Ruth's body may have been caused by the exposed nails protruding from the sole where the heel had detached. In addition to these injuries, Ruth had suffered a powerful blow across her chest, spanning from shoulder to shoulder and measuring about 4 inches wide. There were also fingernail marks on her neck, indicating she had been strangled. However, her official cause of death was determined to be a broken neck. A bloody slip found at the scene was believed to have been used in an attempt to clean the shoe. Other pieces of evidence collected from the home included a bloodied cloth rag, discovered beneath Ruth's body, and several blood-stained paper towels found both near her and inside the bathroom. Investigators pieced together a theory that the struggle had begun in the bedroom. Blood was discovered between the pillows and along the side of the bed, suggesting Ruth had initially been attacked there. A broken lamp was also found in the room. Authorities collected fingerprints from various areas of the house, but they ultimately did not yield any useful leads in the investigation. Several items were reported missing from the home, including a $1 bill that had been left on a dresser, a Ronson lighter, and a watch valued at $185. Despite the gruesome scene, the couple's infant son, Clarence, was found unharmed in his crib. However, since the baby had likely been left alone for most of the day, Russell felt too overwhelmed by the tragedy to care for him. Instead, he turned to his second ex-wife, Betty Lehman, for help. Betty and her new husband were close friends with both Russell and Ruth, and she was more than willing to take in the baby during such a devastating time. As the investigation began, officers from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office quickly started forming theories about the crime. One of their initial was that Ruth's murder could have been an act of revenge. However, Russell was regarded as an upstanding man with no known enemies. Ruth, originally from Zanesville, had lost her father and had worked as a waitress at the Broad Hog restaurant for 5 years before meeting Russell. Those who knew her described her as quiet and pleasant, noting that she rarely discussed her personal life. At one point, authorities questioned a former colleague of Russell's in connection with the case, but he was ultimately released without any charges. Investigators also considered the possibility that the killer had used the nearby train tracks as an entry and exit route. However, this theory was eventually dismissed. Authorities then turned their attention to potential strangers seen lingering in the neighborhood around the time of the murder, though they couldn't be certain exactly when it had occurred. Initially, the coroner estimated Ruth's death had taken place 12 to 15 hours before she was discovered. However, this timeline changed once investigators confirmed that she had last been seen alive at 5:30 a.m. and was last heard on the phone between 8:35 and 8:45 a.m. Based on this, authorities suspected she had been killed sometime around noon. Shortly after the murder, a sheriff's deputy cryptically stated, "We have a theory about the mysterious stranger, but we're not disclosing it." When investigators spoke with neighbors, they learned that 2 witnesses had seen an unknown man knocking on doors before leaving when no one answered. The first sighting occurred around 7:45 a.m., while the second took place roughly an hour later, just before 9 a.m. One witness reported that the same man later approached the Alters home and described him as standing between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 0 inches tall, carrying a brown leather briefcase, and wearing a blue-gray suit. However, another neighbor, who had been working in his garden from 8 a.m. to noon, claimed he hadn't seen anyone unfamiliar in the area during that time. Russell was questioned shortly after discovering Ruth's body. He was interrogated by authorities for a total of 9 hours, excluding breaks, and was subjected to a polygraph test, which he passed. The 39-year-old arrived at work at 6:40 a.m. alongside a colleague, an engineer, and the two worked their shift together from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. Russell had an excellent work record, and with his solid alibi and his successful polygraph test, authorities ruled him out as a suspect. It's worth noting that in 1951, polygraph tests were given far more weight than they are today, as modern courts often deemed them inadmissible. In total, 6 individuals were questioned and released on the day of Ruth's murder, including Russell's ex-wife, Betty Lehman. In the days that followed, investigators announced that the unidentified man seen by multiple witnesses on the morning of April 25th was likely a salesman. Additionally, they began searching for a late model blue Chevrolet that had been parked across the street from the Alta residence that day. Several new and previously unknown details emerged during this period. First, it was revealed that strands of brown and gray hair clutched in Ruth's hand at the time of her death were lost when the coroner, deeming them unimportant, allowed an attendant assisting with the post-mortem to wash them away. Secondly, authorities discovered 2 pearl-covered buttons lying next to Ruth's body at the crime scene. They are likely to have come from a woman's coat or a men's sports jacket, with the coroner stating that they were apparently from a woman's clothing. Notably, there were no buttons on the garments Ruth was wearing when she was killed. The reveal of the buttons found at the scene led to some speculation that a woman was responsible for the death, or at least involved in some way. Over the next few weeks, investigators followed several leads. They looked into the backgrounds of 2 brothers who had left bloody clothing in their sister's home. The brothers denied any knowledge of the case and the bloody clothing, which was never found. They also checked out a dress with missing buttons which had been given to a dry cleaner. Around this time, there were rumors that Ruth had previously testified against a Columbus-based narcotics ring, and her mother-in-law, Stella, was subject to an eerie, threatening phone call where a woman said, quote, "Mrs. Alter, ain't you dead yet? You two will be murdered soon." Though Stella hung up immediately, the person called back. They were never identified. Stella stated she sounded like she was either drunk or trying to disguise her voice. A former girlfriend of Russell's who'd reportedly taken a strong dislike to Ruth and threatened her was separately investigated, followed by a red-haired youth who'd assaulted a local 57-year-old. But despite all the possible leads and information, the police were unable to find anything solid. In early May, those close to Ruth and Russell were re-interrogated along with other potential persons of interest, including a 40-year-old waitress who was an ex-girlfriend of Russell. She would later be cleared of involvement after passing a polygraph test. Still, no motive for Ruth's murder surfaced. Authorities then decided to offer a $500 reward for anyone with information leading to an arrest and conviction of Ruth's killer, but the large sum of cash went unclaimed. Several weeks later, a 23-year-old salesman was questioned in connection with the case, with witnesses identifying his car as the one seen parked outside of the Alta home on the morning of the murder. With the identification of the car, investigators told reporters, "We are optimistic there will be evidential proof against this man as the investigation develops during the day." They added that the young man was a former friend of Ruth's and had been questioned twice previously. He came back to the attention of law enforcement when they examined his statements and noticed some discrepancies. They claimed he was still changing his story during interviews. Police also noted that they believed the killer was someone known to Ruth because she appeared to have let that person into her home. Authorities revealed there was some circumstantial evidence against the 23-year-old who was not immediately identified. The evidence included a lack of an alibi, bloodstains discovered on both his brake pedal, and the cuffs of the trousers of a blue-gray suit he owned, with both stains confirmed as being human blood, and a business card with his name on it which was discovered inside the Alter home. The salesman claimed that the blood came from a slaughterhouse he had visited as part of his work and denied being involved in the murder. He failed the polygraph test shortly afterwards. Then, on May 19th, the salesman's identity was revealed. 23-year-old George Phillips was the son of the owner of the Broad Hog restaurant, where Ruth had spent 5 years working before her marriage to Russell. Authorities announced, quote, "results of the lie detector test plus evidence warrant filing an affidavit." George was subsequently charged with first-degree murder. George Phillips was in part raised by his grandmother, who'd moved to America from Greece when her children, including George's mother, were young. A terrifying accident when he was just 2 years old, which involved him running out into the road after his ball and being struck by a car, saw part of his right arm be amputated. Although this made things difficult for him growing up, George often took advantage of the way his peers would underestimate him. Our patron, Jenny, reached out to one of his childhood friends who told her he would often play up his handicap to older children at the park and challenge them to games of tennis where, if he won, they would hand over their money. The older children, surprised by his boldness, would agree to the bet and be easily beaten by George, who walked away with their cash in his pocket. George was described by those who knew him as likable and pleasant. He began attending university after graduating from school but ultimately dropped out and became employed as a salesman. A local grocery store owner recalled how the last time he saw the 23-year-old shortly before his arrest, he had been discussing his favorite soup recipes. According to newspapers at the time, George had known Ruth through her work at his father's restaurant for 4 years, and the two had reportedly had a run-in at some point during this time, with investigators stating that back then, Ruth had slapped the young man for an inappropriate remark he'd made to her. George then hit Ruth back, with police quoting him as saying, "I hit her harder than I intended to." Authorities suggested that a similar set of events had led to the mother of one's death on April 25th. They theorized that George had come to the house to see the newborn baby and secure a time to discuss taking out an insurance policy for him. Then at some point during the visit, the 23-year-old hit Ruth perhaps harder than he meant to, and she'd struck her head on the bed and lost consciousness. When she came to, she ordered George out and followed him into the living room, where she picked up one of her husband's shoes and hit the young man with it. George then lost his temper and retaliated by grabbing the footwear and beating Ruth with it until she fell to the ground. Detective Lieutenant Lester Bauman describes George as an unfortunate youth with a violent temper. Upon searching George's home again, which he shared with his grandmother, investigators discovered a pair of shoes that they hadn't previously been able to locate. The shoes had blood on the soles, but it was obvious that an attempt had been made to clean them. Similarly, a briefcase was found that also had traces of blood on it. Authorities observed that the 23-year-old drove a blue 1937 Pontiac. During the initial court hearing, 3 colleagues testified that George was in a work meeting and was later at a restaurant on the morning of the murder. His defense also produced a witness who countered what 2 of the prosecution's witnesses were saying, that an unidentified man matching George's description had come to their doors earlier that day. The defense's witness was that same man we mentioned earlier, who was out working in his garden all morning and saw nobody odd or unfamiliar come or go. George's defense lawyer, Paul Herbert, also questioned Russell Alter during this time, making sure to interrogate him over the state of his marriage and his personal life, even querying the paternity of the couple's son, Clarence. George Phillips was ultimately released on a $50,000 bond due to an obscure Ohio law. 21 of his friends and relatives pledged the $50,000 in cash or property, allowing him to leave jail until his formal trial started. Upon his release, George stated, "It is with the sincerest appreciation and deepest humility that I take this opportunity to express my thanks to my many friends for their confidence in me." In August, the Franklin County Grand Jury indicted George on second-degree murder after hearing testimony from 33 witnesses. If found guilty, he would be sentenced to life behind bars but could be considered for parole after 10 years. The following month, Ruth's body was exhumed. She had been laid to rest in Rose Hill Cemetery, south of Zanesville, in a plot near her father's. The Franklin County prosecutor, Ralph Barlett, told reporters no comments when news broke of this development. Newspaper accounts observed that Ruth's face and neck were studied and photographs were taken of her closed casket. Finally, on October 23rd, George's trial began. Paul Herbert, his lawyer, filed a notice of alibi just days earlier, despite the fact that the prosecution had still not narrowed down Ruth's time of death, stating that it was unknown to the state of Ohio, when Herbert pushed for a detailed answer to help him with his client's alibi. During the trial, further circumstantial evidence came to light, including witness testimony that a bloody shirt had been found among George's laundry. The defense meanwhile noted that fingernail marks had been found on both sides of Ruth's neck and pointed out that George only had his left hand. It was also at this time that several witnesses for the prosecution began receiving threats via telephone. One woman was told, quote, "Well, you better watch out." Another answered the phone to hear, quote, "You and your husband are on the spot. He had better keep his mouth shut." The witness said the voice was in broken English. 2 other witnesses received threats, but the source of the harassment was never found. Paul Herbert is known to have dismissed the concerns of the prosecution in this matter, stating his belief that the publicity-hungry witnesses had made up the stories. Ruth's case and the trial were highly publicized and eventually gave way to a media circus. George's defense lawyer and the Franklin County prosecutor were known enemies with a lengthy history, and eventually the trial became more of a mudslinging match involving the egos of two feuding men rather than a true attempt to find justice for a horrific tragedy. After weeks of testimony, the jury was not convinced. On November 9th, George Phillips was acquitted of all charges. According to our patron, Jenny, following this, George became something of a social pariah. He lost his job and his reputation remained in tatters. He was never able to go back to the life he once lived and wound up moving to Los Angeles, California to start over where nobody knew his name. Russell Alter, the husband Ruth left behind, didn't fare much better. He lost both of his jobs thanks in no small part to the authorities considering him a suspect early on, and him undergoing arrests and questioning several times throughout the investigation. A 1953 article from the Columbus Evening Dispatch observes that Russell filed a civil lawsuit against George Phillips charging that the 25-year-old wrongfully, unlawfully, maliciously, and intentionally killed his wife and seeking $75 $0.0.9 today in damages for himself and his son. Russell also sued the Franklin County Sheriff Ralph Paul for $25,000 claiming he was falsely arrested, and noting that he spent 4 days in prison in April 1951. Just days after he found his wife murdered. He added that the arrest was done without a warrant and without reasonable or probable cause, noting that it was a humiliating experience and that his reputation never bounced back. Sheriff Paul declined to comment for the article. 5 months after reports emerged about Russell's lawsuits, Evening Dispatch announced that the 42-year-old was set to remarry. His fourth wife, Alice Atkins, was a divorced mother of 4 and was acquainted with the couple before Ruth's murder. She was one of the people questioned by police following the discovery of the body. Alice remained married to Russell until he died in 1964. He was 53 years old. Russell and Ruth's son, Clarence Frederick, or Fred as he prefers to be known, recalled Alice as a kind woman who raised him as her own and gave him a happy childhood, all things considered. Meanwhile, his father made sure to keep in regular contact with Ruth's side of the family, and they would attend King family reunions every summer. Our patron, Jenny, connected with Fred on Facebook, where she was able to learn a bit about his life. During their conversation, Fred shared an interesting story about a phone call he had received years ago while at work. The call came from an older man who asked how he was doing, whether he was happy, and if he had lived a good life. Fred recalled that the conversation was brief but polite, and the caller never gave his name. It wasn't until after he hung up that Fred began to wonder if the man on the other end of the line had been George Phillips, who would have been in his 70s at the time and still living in Los Angeles. No one else was ever charged in Ruth's murder after George was acquitted, and even 70 years later, her case remains unsolved. Moving on to the next case. Louis Matseli. For many, the 1980s are defined by the era's cultural milestones, whether it's Steven Spielberg's E.T., The Extraterrestrial, or Michael Jackson's Thriller, both of which remain legendary in the world of entertainment. However, beyond the glitz and glamour of the time, online sleuths associate the decade with a string of perplexing cold cases that remain unsolved to this day. One such case is that of Louis Matseli. Born on February 15, 1977, in Stanhope, New Jersey, Louis Anthony Matseli was the second eldest child of Harold and Sheila Matseli. Harold worked in manufacturing, while Sheila was a stay-at-home mother. The couple had 4 children in total: Harold, Louis, Sheila, and Edward. In 1983, the family relocated to Allentown, Pennsylvania. Louis was known to be both sociable and talkative, yet he was also considered a shy loner. He had a deep fear of sleeping alone and frequently stayed out late, often until 9:30 p.m., engaging in conversations with strangers. Notably, he seemed to feel more at ease around adults than with children his own age. Louis also struggled with a short attention span, difficulty writing, and found it hard to concentrate in school. Because of these challenges, he was set to join a class for children with learning difficulties when he returned to school in the fall of 1984. According to his Charlie Project page, he had been diagnosed as hyperactive and was prescribed 2 daily doses of Ritalin. Without his medication, he reportedly experienced memory lapses. On June 7, 1984, 7-year-old Louis came home from school and told his aunt, who was babysitting while his father was at work and his mother was in the hospital recovering from surgery, that he was heading just 2 doors down to visit his friends. Shortly after, multiple witnesses spotted him walking between 4th Street and Gordon Street, about a block from his apartment on the 360 block of Chew Street. What happened to Lewis after this sighting remains a mystery. When he didn't return home for dinner, his family wasn't initially concerned, as he often stayed out late. However, as the clock reached 9:30 p.m. and he was still nowhere to be found, his parents grew increasingly worried. They set out in the dark, searching the streets, checking all his usual hangout spots, and calling his name. But despite their efforts, Lewis was nowhere to be found. Around 11:10 p.m., his parents returned home and contacted the authorities. According to one report, despite his young age, they were allegedly told they had to wait 24 hours before filing a missing persons report. However, since this claim appears in only one source, it should be taken with caution. Details about the subsequent investigation are scarce, but records indicate that authorities conducted an extensive search of the area. A potential lead emerged when the owner of Marco's Doggy Shop, a local hot dog stand, informed authorities that Lewis had entered the store around 4 p.m. and stayed for approximately 45 minutes. The boy reportedly mentioned that he was trying to avoid 2 teenage boys who had been chasing him. At 4:45 p.m., he left the shop and was last seen walking east on Gordon Street. His parents later speculated that he may have been heading to visit an elderly woman named Helen, whose company he particularly enjoyed. The 2 teenagers who had reportedly been harassing Lewis were questioned by the police but were ultimately ruled out as suspects. Around the same time, another witness came forward, claiming to have seen Lewis speaking with an unidentified man and woman in a park near Jordan Creek, roughly 1 block from his home. This encounter was said to have taken place around 4:30 p.m., the same time that the hot dog stand owner claimed Lewis was inside his shop. Due to this conflicting timeline, authorities were unable to verify the accuracy of the sighting, though they did not dismiss it outright. Notably, Lewis was known to enjoy spending time by Jordan Creek. Shortly before his disappearance, he had told his family that he hoped to visit Dorney Park one day. However, despite searches of these areas, investigators found no trace of the missing boy. For a time, his parents, Sheila and Harold McHalley, were considered suspects, a common occurrence in cases involving missing children. However, the family later expressed frustration and distress over the fact that investigators spent the early years of the case repeatedly focusing on them instead of pursuing other leads. Their eldest son, Harold, told reporters that he thought about Lewis every single day. Harold also refuted claims that his parents had been abusive, stating that these rumors had devastated them. Reflecting on their treatment by authorities, he remarked the cops, literally for like the first 3 years, were useless before they finally said, maybe somebody outside the family actually did do something. Despite the scrutiny, the Mochalice cooperated fully with the investigation. They made national television appeals, journalists into their home, and attended news conferences in hopes of keeping Lewis's case in the public eye. Local gossip suggested that Lewis had suffered from abuse or neglect, but social services found no evidence to support these claims. In an effort to clear their names, both Harold and Sheila agreed to take polygraph tests, which they passed, and they were ultimately removed from the list of suspects. However, a troubling detail 6 months before his disappearance, in January 1984, Lewis had told his parents, school nurse, and psychologist that he had been sexually abused by a couple named Frank and Elizabeth. His accounts varied. One version described an assault near the railroad tracks on Jordan Street, while another suggested that the couple had taken him to an apartment in Allentown and later returned him to his neighborhood. Investigators considered the possibility that multiple incidents had occurred. Reportedly, the pair had threatened to harm Lewis if he told anyone about what they've done to him. While the police were notified about the events that the young boy was describing, Lewis was unable to provide enough evidence that would allow the authorities to investigate. For example, he was unable to give law enforcement the couple's surname or their address, and it's possible Frank and Elizabeth were false first names. Even today, it's unclear whether these events really happened or if they were linked to his disappearance. although many internet sleuths have noted that it could have been this Frank and Elizabeth who was seen with Lewis at around 4:30 p.m. on the day that he vanished. For years later, in 1988, a private investigator from New York named David Riggs set up an organization named Search 7 with the intention of assisting in the search for several missing young children, including Lewis. In fact, Lewis's case was the first that the organization took on. Riggs felt that the crime was financially motivated and claimed that he was an expert in child abduction cases based on his graduate degree in sociology and his work with runaway children in New York City. However, Riggs' facade fell apart later that year when he was arrested in West Virginia after accosting 5 young boys, offering to pay them money as they would pose in bikini underwear for him. Luckily, none of the boys agreed to his proposal. Additionally, Riggs didn't have a New York private investigator license, and his organization was not registered as a non-profit corporation in that state. He'd also reportedly served time in prison before, although sources differ as to why, with some saying he'd been in prison over child sexual abuse charges and others claiming it was for unrelated crimes. Regardless, as a result of these crimes, Riggs pleaded guilty on 2 counts of attempted child abduction and 1 count of sexual abuse and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. Investigators working on Lewis's case looked into the possibility that David Riggs was involved but ultimately ruled him out. There were numerous reported sightings of Lewis after his disappearance. One anonymous tipster claimed that the 7-year-old was attending school in Pottsville, Pennsylvania under a different name. But Sheila Mackley saw the boy in person and denied it was her son. Another witness saw a young boy in New Jersey who closely resembled Lewis and even took Ritalin. But in a strange coincidence, it turned out that the child was actually Lewis's cousin. One child was even picked up on 4 separate occasions by police because he closely resembled Lewis, so his father produced a birth certificate to put the officers' minds at rest. Lewis was one of the first missing children whose image was placed on milk cartons and billboards across the country. But still, despite these efforts, the 7-year-old never came home. There are few theories in his case. Most online sleuths believe that Lewis was abused by Frank and Elizabeth, and that they harmed him for telling on them or abducted him for their own reasons and eventually killed him. However, for some time, the Mackles believed that Lewis was still alive but had no memory of his true identity. After he vanished, Lewis's parents kept their remaining children within arm's reach at all times. According to their eldest son, Harold, their parents spent much of their time afterwards sitting by the phone waiting for someone to call to tell them that their boy had been found. This call never came. Harold recalls that his mother spent much of that time in constant tears. In February 2004, Sheila told reporters, quote, "You keep hearing the saying that time heals things. But in this case, time just makes it worse. It's not getting better. It's getting worse." 11 months after the disappearance, the Mackles moved out of their apartment and into their new home, the same house that had once been occupied by Helen, the elderly woman whom Lewis was so fond of. Helen reportedly went to a retirement home, and the Mackles hoped that one day Lewis would return remembering this house and recalling how much he liked it. He had even dreamt of living in it himself one day. However, sadly, Sheila and Harold were unable to keep the mortgage repayments on the home. Although the local community raised $10,000 to help them keep it, the couple filed for bankruptcy and moved to Effort, Pennsylvania in 1989. As of February 2018, the residence on Chew Street is still vacant. For years afterwards, the family bought toys and gifts for Lewis, hoping one day he'd be able to open and play with them. However, on his 18th birthday, they felt it had become too difficult. They packed away the toys, his belongings, and even his photographs and missing posters and placed them into storage. 7-year-old Lewis Anthony Mackley was last seen on June 7, 1984 in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Multiple witnesses saw him walking between 4th Street and Gordon Street that afternoon after he returned from school about a block from his home in the 360 block of Chew Street. Lewis is described as a young boy with learning and emotional difficulties. When he went missing, he was taking Ritalin twice a day to help with his hyperactivity disorder. He is a white male with brown hair and was missing 4 of his front teeth when he was last seen. Lewis had 2 distinctive circular burn scars on the right side of his chest. He was also known for his unique posture, often walking slowly while leaning forward and frequently placing his hands on his hips when speaking. At the time he went missing, Lewis was between 4 feet 0 inches and 4 feet 1 inch tall, weighing approximately 44 pounds. He was last seen wearing either a short-sleeved green striped shirt or a navy and white striped shirt, along with blue trousers or jeans that had a red tag on the rear pockets reading, "Doggy." His outfit also included an elastic belt with a trim and a buckle shaped like a train, pink socks, and brown shoes. If Lewis is still alive today, he would be 44 years old. Anyone with information regarding his disappearance is encouraged to contact the Allentown Police Department at 610-437-7721. Siberian Komer-Daiban Mountain Range Tragedy. In August 1993, during the height of summer, 6 spirited and adventurous friends, all passionate about the outdoors and backpacking, set off on a journey most nature enthusiasts could only dream of. However, what began as a relatively simple trek quickly turned tragic when sudden and inexplicable symptoms claimed the lives of 6 out of the 7 hikers. Throughout the 1990s, and even today, though to a lesser extent, groups of tourists from Russia and Ukraine frequently travel to the Siberian Komer-Daiban mountain range to explore its vast coniferous forests, rich with cedar trees and pristine freshwater lakes. This mountain range encircles the Pearl of Siberia, a lake that contains approximately 20% of the world's fresh surface water, more than the combined volume of all the North American Great Lakes. Even now, thousands of visitors journey to these mountains each year to witness the breathtaking beauty of Siberia's wilderness. The 6 highly capable hikers, all between the ages of 15 and 24, hailed from Petropavlovsk, Russia, and had spent years honing their outdoor survival skills. Despite their youth, all 6 had extensive experience with long-distance hikes and survival expeditions of varying difficulty. Their chosen trek took them through the rugged Komer-Daiban Mountains, one of the earliest documented mountain ranges in history and the world's oldest mapped landmass. Since the range borders Lake Baikal to the south, it boasts stunning landscapes and is uniquely accessible by air travel, allowing more people to explore its rolling hills and towering peaks. However, for this unfortunate group, the adventure would take a horrifying turn as they encountered an unknown and deadly force, one that would ultimately leave only a single survivor. Leading this enthusiastic team of 6 was the highly skilled and respected guide Lyudmila Ivanovna Korovina. Korovina was remembered as a strikingly beautiful, strong-willed, and athletic woman, a 41-year-old expert survivalist and the head of Azimuth Petropavlovsk's renowned tourist club, which was part of a larger outdoor education program. Her reputation as a world-class leader and wilderness instructor made her highly sought after, with adventurers traveling great distances for the chance to hike under her guidance. Having trained extensively for years, she was occasionally criticized for her strict survivalist approach, yet former students were willing to travel across the country to learn from her. One of her former hiking team members once remarked, asterisk, "She knew how to unite people to create a team. She believed in others. Asterisk, asterisk. She had a way of bringing out a person's true potential." Under her mentorship, each of us was able to push our limits and grow in every aspect of life. The hikers under Korovina's leadership ranged in age from 15 to 24. The oldest among them was 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko. Another key member was 23-year-old Alexander Sasha Kresin, who was more than just a student. Many considered him an adopted son to Korovina. The 23-year-old, affectionately called Sasha, a common Russian nickname for Alexander, had been mentored by Korovina for years. More than just a student of her survival techniques, he was a trusted family friend. The rest of the group included 19-year-old Denis Vashin, 17-year-old Valentina Valia Yudachenko, and 16-year-old Victoria Vika Zalasova, the least experienced among them. Vika had participated in previous hiking trips, but not as extensively as the others. She had joined the expedition as a friend of another member, and while Korovina initially hesitated to include her, acknowledging that even Vika's own friends admitted she could be quite vocal in her complaints, she was ultimately invited along. The youngest of the group was 15-year-old Tamir Babanov, who, despite his age, was remarkably skilled in outdoor survival. By the end of the journey, only one of the 7 would survive to recount the terrifying ordeal. Victoria, Denis, Alexander, Tamir, Tatiana, Valentina, and their seasoned leader, Korovina, set out around August 1st, though some reports suggest it may have been August 2nd. Their trek began in the village of Moreno, leading them through the Langutai Gate Gorge. As they progressed, they eventually reached the highest point of their route, ascending Kanyolu, the tallest peak in the Kumardaban range. From there, they began the descent, unaware that their journey was about to take a deadly turn. After crossing the Antigua and Baixa rivers, the group continued their journey toward the Watershed Plateau, reaching this area around August 4th. By this time, they had been trekking for several days, covering an estimated 70 kilometers, roughly 44 miles, through rugged terrain. Their route was classified as a Level 3 trek on a scale of 1 to 5, making it challenging but not among the most extreme difficulty levels. Despite the demands of the journey, the hikers took time to forage, gather, and dry goldenroot, a medicinal plant known for its restorative properties. They eventually reached a summit situated between two towering peaks, Faliats Eugenli, which rises to approximately 2,204 meters, and Tiliotranas, standing at about 2,310 meters. At this altitude, the group was nearly 7,545 feet above sea level. However, their chosen campsite raised some questions. They set up camp on a windswept plateau, an exposed and barren ridge offering no natural shelter from the increasingly strong gusts. Those familiar with the region describe this area as almost otherworldly, with a landscape resembling that of Mars. The sloped terrain offered little more than rocks, dry grass, and howling winds, leaving many to question why the group chose this exposed location for their campsite instead of a much safer grove of trees just 4 kilometers, about 2.5 miles, away. This alternative site, situated in a lower forest zone, would have required descending approximately 400 meters over 1,300 feet, but it would have provided far better protection from the worsening weather. Local rescuers also pointed out another viable option. The hikers could have climbed to the top of the nearest mountain, where an emergency shelter had been constructed specifically for tourists. There, they would have found dry firewood and a designated place to rest, offering them much-needed refuge from the brutal storm that was rapidly closing in. Reaching this emergency shelter would have taken only 30 minutes, yet for reasons unknown to investigators, Corvinia did not lead her group there. This decision puzzled many, sparking debate among hindsight critics who questioned why she had not chosen the tree-covered grove instead. Those familiar with Corvina's teaching methods speculated that she may have intentionally picked the exposed ridge as a training exercise, aiming to challenge her team's survival skills in harsh conditions. However, another, more somber theory emerged. Some wondered if the group stopped in this barren, unprotected landscape because any detour, either toward the forest or the shelter, would have taken them off their planned route. Corvinia had arranged to meet another hiking group, and deviating from the designated path might have delayed their scheduled rendezvous. Corvinia had been managing 2 hiking groups simultaneously, a fairly common practice for extended backpacking expeditions in the region. This particular trek was designed as part of a larger multi-group journey, with the hikers scheduled to rendezvous at predetermined locations along the route. In a tragic twist of fate, the leader of the second group was none other than Corvina's own daughter. Although neither leader carried walkie-talkies, they had arranged to meet at approximately 4 designated points along the trail, believing these intersections would be sufficient to maintain communication in case of any issues. Both mother and daughter were seasoned survivalists, and their plan was to eventually merge their groups and complete the final stretch of the journey together, an unforgettable mother-daughter adventure in the making. However, instead of reuniting with her mother as planned, Corvina's daughter, assuming the worsening weather had disrupted their schedule, continued onward with her own group. After completing the trek, the 16-year-old flew back to her hometown in Kazakhstan, entirely unaware that her mother had died in the very same vicinity and at the very same time she was hiking. Unlike a steep mountain peak, the area the hikers were traversing was more of a rounded dome. And given that it was summertime, the weather had been forecasted to remain mild. Corvinia had carefully studied meteorological reports before the trip, ensuring the group was well prepared for expected conditions. However, on their third day, they were unexpectedly met with freezing rain and light snowfall. What they could not have known was that, on August 3rd, a Mongolian cyclone had swept into the Irkutsk region, an unforeseen weather event that directly contradicted the projections Corvina had relied upon. The formation of the shockingly strong surface winds caused by the passage of the cyclonic cold front took the hikers by surprise, and by nightfall the wind had become terroristic and oppressive in its unyielding nature. Their trek took them on the border of two climate zones, the West Siberian Plains and Mongolia to the south of Lake Baikal, and in both zones, the weather phenomenon of cyclogenesis can be created. This summertime event was unexpected based on forecasts, but not rare for the region. Because of the lack of internet technology at the time, the exact temperatures for that day are unknown. While publicly accessible weather histories of the Irkutsk region only go back as far as 1999, a look at the average temperatures historically show no instances of extreme cold in the month of August. Data for the Irkutsk region state that the average low is only 11 degrees Celsius and the average high is around 21 degrees Celsius. This means that historically the region did not get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. However warm the temperature was forecasted to be, the group was prepared for rain in general as the region averaged 15 days of rain in the month of August, with Siberia experiencing the most rain in the summer months. So, while the cyclone was unexpected in its ferocity, the group was prepared to encounter rain overall and did indeed have the proper supplies and clothing. At 4 in the morning on August 5th, the seams of the hikers' tents, already tight from being blown in the wind and close to breaking, burst, and while the experienced group fixed what material they could, the wind and dew persisted through the damaged tents, and at 6 a.m., they awoke again to wet sleeping bags and decided to begin their day as sleep was not going to come with their dampness. At around 11 a.m. on August 5th, a wet and weather-beaten group broke down the already very broken-down campsite and started walking again. Prior to the time that the group was able to pack up and leave, Sasha, the 24-year-old, walked up to one of the tents and complained, presumably to Korovina, of feeling ill. Despite feeling unwell, his symptoms not specified, Sasha decided to press on with the group in hopes of traversing more ground and completing yet another hike. Unfortunately, within the first few kilometers of the group's hike, Sasha started to stumble and fall. Sasha fell multiple times until he became so weak that everyone else in the group had to take on his pack load and help him along. Sasha, the oldest male of the group at age 24 and Korovina's so-called adopted son, then began bleeding from the ears and started foaming at the mouth. Alarmed, Korovina decided to stay back with Sasha and administer aid. She encouraged the remaining two men, one only 15 and the other 19 years old, to lead the rest of the group to the tree line below in order to dry off and hopefully get their firewood to a state that it was able to be burned. However, halfway to the forest edge, the group turned back. Why specifically is unknown, but it can be assumed that something felt very wrong and the young adults wanted to be close to their leader. One of the group members, Tatiana, brought Korovina a tent in hopes of erecting a temporary shelter from the now roaring storm that had descended upon the valley. When the group looked to Sasha for his condition, they saw his eyes were wide and dark and his pupils dilated. When Tatiana tried to get the now unresponsive, Sasha moved under a tent to partially protect him from the oppressive wind. Val tried to help her, but Korovina told them both to stop what they were doing and go straight to the trees and seek shelter. Upon hearing this, Val, 17, grabbed her friend Victoria, 16, to bring her along to the shelter of the forest. But Victoria proceeded to bite Val's hand in response. Shocked but not deterred, Val had to drag the now incomprehensible teen by her hair to the resting point, with Victoria fighting and kicking back most of the way. Val, not yet to the trees because of the now hostile Victoria, turned back around to seek out Korovina. This time to complain that Victoria was not being cooperative in getting to the trees. When Val returned to the group members, she came upon a startling scene. Tatiana was bent double, intentionally banging her own head against the rocks over and over again. Val then looked to Tamir, the 15-year-old, who was grasping at his throat like he couldn't breathe. He soon collapsed. Dennis, the 19-year-old, screamed at Val to grab sleeping supplies and get to the shelter quickly. But when she looked back to reply, she watched him drop the sleeping bag he had just retrieved and fall to the ground, violently writhing and ripping at the clasps of his clothes, just as the other 5 had done. When Val tried to help him, he too fought her off, kicking, adamant in his refusal for her assistance. Bleeding profusely from the ears and foaming at the mouth, 6 of the 7 members of the group had now descended into what could only be described as madness, witnessed only by one unscathed and uncertain 17-year-old. Some of the group members were hiding behind rocks. One had slunk into their sleeping bag panic-stricken. Others ran around aimlessly. Val stood helpless as the whole group writhed on the floor, banging their heads against the rocks and the ground and ripping and tearing at their clothes. Some of the members, now in partial states of undress, gradually stopped moving while others continued to shake and move about. Knowing she was incapable of helping more than she already had, Val grabbed enough supplies to temporarily survive the storm and headed to the tree line. There she made enough of an awning underneath the cover of a stone to keep the wind at bay, and eventually she fell into a not-so-restful sleep. The next morning after the storm had passed, Val went back to investigate her group mate's condition. She found that at least 5 of the 6 group members had passed away in the night. She later recalls that upon returning to their bodies, she did not expect anyone to be alive because the symptoms exhibited that night prior seemed fatal, but that she needed both closure and supplies. While some reports say that Val closed each of her fellow friends' eyes, what she actually said became lost in translation in the media, and what she purportedly said, according to a local Russian translator, was not that she closed their eyes but that she closed or averted her own eyes from the dead. Some sources say that at this point, the morning after the mass psychosis exhibited by the group, that group leader Korovina was still alive and able to feebly give Val directions on how to escape the mountains. But this is not repeated in other sources, so that detail is still in debate. What is known is that the 17-year-old then took a compass, food rations and other survival tools from the back of the deceased group leader and set out to find the Inikta River, a known landmark to the young woman who was now traversing alone. The nearby river was too rough to cross, so Val camped out for the night near an electric tower. When the sun rose the next morning, she saw that there were wires running from the electric tower. Val attempted to find safety in civilization by visually tracing and following the electric cables and wires which brought service to some of the most remote parts of Siberia. But unfortunately the cables just ended at a remote and abandoned town devoid of occupants, food or phone service. Let down by the false promise of hope from the presence of electric wires in a town long abandoned, Val then attempted to follow the water pipes which flowed from the empty village. That led her to a nearby river where she then became so exhausted from her 3-day trek that she stopped to rest, hanging her white t-shirt on the limbs of a tree to dry out. Knowing that she had little food and light warmth for survival, the haggard and weary teenager later recalled that at that point she was preparing herself for death. As luck would have it, tourists from Kiev, Ukraine who were out rafting saw Val on the riverbanks. Initially, they were not alarmed as the 17-year-old made no attempt whatsoever to call out to them and didn't show outward signs of distress. Eventually, the tourists' consciousness got the better of them and they turned around to check on the lone teenager and make sure that she was safe. At this point, logic had come back to Val and she was waving at them furiously. Upon their approach, she rushed at them crying that people were dead and she was scared. She was taken by the concerned tourists to a local hospital and authorities were contacted. After her initial outcry, she clammed up and became almost catatonic once safe in the hospital. This type of reaction is common for someone who has just exerted a high amount of adrenaline for an extended period of time. At the hospital, Val was at first reticent to share her story with the investigators, but eventually some of the details came out, however murky. These details given by Val and the recollections of her rescue and outcry to the tourists were the only ones that the media had access to and some of the only immediate accounts of the incident. For this reason, some details may have been slightly altered or possibly lost in translation. The bodies of the 6 group members had to remain alone for weeks, visited only by scavengers, until August 26th. Although some reports say it was 21st, because the mountains were far too windy and dangerous to find and recover the bodies safely. Members of the search and rescue party, sent to the scene of the incident by helicopter, recall that the bodies were paired off in smaller groups, scattered across 40 to 50 meters of ground. The 6 hikers, previously young, strong, virulent, and full of life, were now reduced to bloated and swollen corpses, with death-imprinted grimaces on their faces and impartial states of undress of their many layers, with some only wearing their thin, full-bodied undergarments. 3 of the stricken were without shoes, a fact which lined up with Val's recollection of the hikers desperately ripping off their garments. Workers recall that Korovina was lying on top of Sasha, possibly in one last act of protection. Rescue workers noted that scavengers had consumed the hikers' eyes and tongues, as soft tissues are typically the first to be targeted post-mortem. The deteriorated state of the bodies left few physical clues for forensic examination, and the powerful windstorm that had swept through the area likely erased any non-biological evidence from the scene. The official autopsy reports, conducted in Ilan Yud, East Siberia, concluded that all 6 hikers had died from hypothermia. However, this explanation did not sit well with friends and family, who couldn't ignore the glaring inconsistencies in the case. Given the region's summer temperature fluctuations, with nighttime lows averaging around 50 degrees Fahrenheit 10 degrees Celsius, the idea that the entire group had simply frozen to death seemed implausible. The most unsettling detail was that a lone survivor, a 17-year-old, neither the largest nor the strongest of the group, managed to endure for 3 more days without any apparent ill effects or cognitive impairment. To those left behind, this scenario seemed highly improbable, leaving them with more questions than answers. Supporters of the hypothermia theory pointed out that the group had been exposed to continuous rain for over 24 hours by the time symptoms began appearing. When combined with wind chill, these conditions could have resulted in extreme cold. Additionally, hypothermia can trigger paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where individuals in a delusional state feel overwhelmingly hot despite actually freezing to death. Some believe that the hikers tearing off their clothing supported this explanation. However, beyond this singular detail, the hypothermia theory failed to align with the disturbing symptoms witnessed by Val, the lone survivor. The horrific scenes she described, including foaming at the mouth, profuse bleeding from the ears, and individuals violently smashing their heads against rocks, bore little resemblance to the typical physiological responses associated with hypothermia. Nowhere in any documented cases of hypothermic patients were such antics observed. Quite to the contrary, in fact, people freezing to death often become slower and more lethargic over time, and eventually stop to take their final rest and pass without violent or even visible symptoms. Additionally, while the weather was inclement and stormy, it was still August summertime. It was not the dead of winter or even in the winter months. Additionally, experts claim that hypothermia being the cause of death does not make sense because that area was not a desert where temperatures can fluctuate rapidly and, as it was August in a forest, the elements, however unyielding, could not have caused such an instantaneous cold with such fatal results. Theories are varied, but with the limited press coverage of this particular incident and the lack of information from Val, theories are all the families of survivors have to hold on to in hopes of receiving some sort of explanation or closure. Later, in what some would say is victim blaming but others say is just common sense, it is said that in Korovina's insistence that they stay on schedule so as to meet up with her daughter and their hiking group on time and to not miss the allotted intersection window, that she made a rash decision which snowballed into a series of fatal mistakes, which led to the death of her charges. Critics say that her unwillingness to traverse a couple miles out of the way in order to seek shelter in the trees could be reasoned as a major contributing factor to the exposure death. But none of this explains why the group members were foaming at the mouth or bleeding from the ears, as that is not a known symptom of exposure. One theory is that the KGB, the Russian Committee for State Security, was testing some new type of weapon, possibly sound or nuclear-based. Some wonder if this could have been a type of weapon which could incapacitate and cause fatalities from some distance away. There is also speculation that a nerve agent of some sort could have been either knowingly or unknowingly unleashed on the unsuspecting campers, as bleeding from the ears is a common symptom of nerve agents. This theory is fueled by the strangeness of the lack of details and the inconsistencies in official reports and media coverage. This conspiracy speculates that Bell, as the only witness to the hypothetical government activities, was paid off and that is the reasoning behind her decision to move far away and her reluctance to discuss the matter. This type of hypothetical weapon, however, doesn't explain why Val was unharmed in the supposed testing, and this theory is more based on conspiracy rather than any concrete evidence. Some postulate that the group's symptoms could align with the consumption of poison mushrooms or some other food-based toxin. Others wonder if their water was contaminated. Some asked if the stew that they consumed as their last meal contained toxins in some form, but doctors interviewed stressed that due to different body metabolism and different enzymatic reactions, that kind of food-based sickness or poisoning would affect each in a slightly different way and at different times, not so synchronously as Val recalls it. No evidence of a food-based illness existed in the autopsy report, and Val recalls that she and the group members shared all food. In response to the fact that they all shared the same food, those researching the case wonder if Val was protected somehow, perhaps by a secret Corvinia was hiding in her rucksack. Some wonder if the sole survivor, Val, may have been the only one to eat the so-called golden root plant that Corvina had been surreptitiously collecting along their trip, an act that possibly protected Val from whatever harm befell the group, be it from a natural or man-made source. Golden root, its scientific name Rhodiola rosea, is a perennial that grows in the wild in the mountains of Siberia. The raw roots are said to be limitless in their potential for medicinal use. In the early 50s, Russian scientists classified golden root as a quote adaptogen because it has the potential to create a bodily resistance to certain toxins and supports one's adaptation to various stressors that might befall the taker. The golden root also contains a chemical called sildenafil. Sildenafil is the active ingredient in the ED drug Viagra. For this reason, the root has a high resale value, especially in remote areas without access to prescription drugs. Golden root has an incredibly slow pattern of growth and only has the potential to help people medicinally when fully matured after nearly 12 years of growth. This long growing period and the root's presence in limited regions makes fully grown golden roots highly valuable and sought after. Rescue workers found a bag of these roots, and some say that this amount shows that Corvinia took more than needed, ostensibly to sell for profit. While some theorize that the consumption of this root was beneficial to Val and that it possibly saved her life, others wonder if the plant was actually the root of all their problems. Those indigenous to the area believe that the golden root has mystical properties, and Siberian folklore states that those who take more than they need for just personal consumption will be spiritually punished. Due to a lack of access to official statements, it is unknown whether Val actually consumed the roots and if they aided her somehow. Was there another death on the mountain? Did another person die on the mountain with the same symptoms of foaming at the mouth and bleeding from the ears? Some sources report that another fatality may have occurred on the same mountain, but no more information is given, and coverage is not only suspiciously light on the actual group's incident, but also in Russian and therefore translated through Google Translate by those who wish to research the incident decades later. Friends of Corvina admit that while Corvina could be extreme in her approach to survivalism, employing tactics that would help the group if they ever encountered an emergency situation, those close to her say that Corvina never took outdoor education to the extreme that her charges would be in danger. A Russian media source initially claimed that the group was food insecure, claiming that the presence of a single soup can and a small tin of meat left at the campsite shows that the group was running on empty. Though most unlikely, the medical examiner considered it because of the absence of insulin in post-mortem blood samples of the victims. The only other medical reason that could explain this lack of glucose in the blood of the deceased, however, would be similar to a diabetic-like type of insulin resistance. But how that could have affected an entire group is unknown. The first issue with the theory that the group was experiencing the effects of malnutrition is that the media source was basing their assumptions on the presence or lack thereof of food waste at the campsite. But those in the backpacking community understand that the best and most respectful hikers always pack out their trash so as to avoid contaminating the area. And because the scene of the incident was not sealed nor protected from the elements for many weeks, it's possible that scavengers and the weather took what remained of the group's food rations and waste. Moreover, it's only logical to think that even if the group was malnourished, they would have slowly wasted away and would not have gone wild banging their heads against the rocks and bleeding from the ears. No publications on those types of symptoms occurring in the actions of those who have starved to death exist, as mania and orifice bleeding are not symptoms of starvation. For this reason, the theory of malnutrition is not one taken seriously and mostly originated in the original Russian media write-ups that relied heavily on second-hand information of the search group, and not from Val herself. This reliance on second-hand information caused the media to make sweeping assumptions without ever knowing the history of Corvinia or her skill sets and methodology. A friend recalls that Corvinia was a stickler for survivalist learning, but she was also someone who would have insisted the hikers be nourished before pressing on, and would not have allowed the young hikers to become so malnourished that they encountered death. Many speak of the professionalism of Corvinia as she was all about triple-checking the supplies. Val, the survivor of the group, says that they planned to have enough food to consume 2,400 calories a day, and that food was not a factor in their untimely demise. The tallest part of the mountain the group climbed that day reached a peak of 2,396 meters. And when the group stopped to rest, they were at 23,100 meters, which is about 7,545 feet above sea level, a high altitude but not one so high that it would cause such extreme illness. For comparison purposes, the lodge at Heavenly and South Lake Tahoe, a common respite for people of all health and ability levels as well as by families with children, has a base altitude of around 2,000 meters 6,000 feet and peaks just above 3,068 meters or around 10,000 feet. This resort and its slopes are enjoyed by those who have driven from San Francisco, a sea-level city, the same day. And while altitude sickness can happen at the resort's highest peaks, it is never as extreme as what the group experienced. Moreover, in the South Lake Tahoe Lodge at the base level of the resort where the hotel is located, which is an almost exact altitude to what the stricken hikers were experiencing, altitude sickness is almost unheard of, and when it manifests itself, it's usually in the form of a headache or light nausea, remedied often by only water. High-altitude pulmonary edema can cause bleeding from the eyes, but bleeding from the ears is not mentioned in the symptoms. Moreover, high-altitude pulmonary edema or cerebral edema often causes symptoms closer to drunkenness rather than rage, violence, or panic. While the hiker's hometown of Petropavlovsk is only 150 meters, roughly 500 feet, above sea level, the hikers had almost a week to acclimate to the increased altitude. So the claims that they could have been sickened with extreme altitude poisoning is doubted by many. Additionally, altitude sickness affects everybody differently depending on many factors, so the fact that all of the group members went mad and were sickened at relatively the same time is not conducive to altitude sickness. Many believe the lack of correlation with the known symptoms of altitude sickness and the data of the hikers' trek upwards show that a force other than the altitude was responsible for the death of 6 previously joyous adventurers. What many believe to be the most logical and explanatory theory, while still not completely perfect in its explanation, lies in the hidden and largely untapped power of sound as a weapon. Some wonder if the Mongolian cyclone which overtook the area was actually an anticyclone. Well, a cyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a center of low atmospheric pressure. An anticyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a high atmospheric pressure with varied results. Some theorize that this particular anticyclone caused such an intense wind that magnetic vibrations began to descend upon the hikers. And when combined with the strong air currents, it set in motion a strange and largely obscure phenomenon called infrasound. While sound has been publicly investigated as a weapon of war from as early as 1957, but most likely far before that unsealed military research, this particular instance of infrasound is hypothesized to have been created by the wind, and that the wind created such a low noise that it became unsettling and possibly fatal. According to one article, the large boulders present on the ridge that the hiker stopped to rest on when hit with unusually strong winds at a certain angle can become a quote infrasonic generator of enormous power, which causes a person to experience a state of panic and unaccountable horror. Because airborne sound of sufficient enters the body by direct absorption and in turn stimulates the non-auditory tissue, infrasound can produce physiological effects essentially similar to a whole-body seizure. This low-frequency noise can be perceived by the brain but not by the ears on a conscious level. When exposed to these types of sounds, the human body has the potential to react to a noise of which it does not realize it is hearing. Such sensations can trigger overwhelming terror and panic, similar to what Val described witnessing. Experts studying infrasound for military applications suggest that high-intensity acoustic energy can lead to a wide range of effects. It may cause temporary or permanent hearing damage, increased heart rate and blood pressure, as well as physical distress such as pain, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. Researchers examining infrasound as a potential weapon have identified 7 Hz as the most dangerous frequency for the brain, as it aligns with the median alpha rhythm of human brain activity. This is particularly concerning because 7 Hz is also the resonant frequency of several internal organs, meaning exposure to such sound waves can directly impact the central nervous system. Existing literature on the subject suggests that prolonged exposure to low-frequency acoustic energy can result in severe disorientation, often accompanied by panic and heightened anxiety. Beyond these psychological effects, additional physiological symptoms, including bowel spasms, vomiting, collapsed lungs, and in extreme cases organ rupture and death, have been documented at frequencies below 7 Hz. Reports indicate that the 6 victims exhibited signs of restlessness, confused speech, anxiety, and disorientation, as noted by Wall. However, one striking inconsistency with the infrasound theory is the presence of ear bleeding among the victims. Moreover, the effects of infrasound at high altitudes remain largely unexplored due to ethical concerns surrounding animal testing and the absence of willing human subjects for experimentation. As a result, gaps in scientific understanding persist, leaving room for the possibility that infrasound may have caused additional, yet unknown, symptoms. Since each human brain and nervous system responds uniquely to external stimuli, not everyone experiences the effects of infrasound in the same manner. This variability could explain why Val remained unaffected while the others succumbed to mysterious symptoms. Factors such as her age, gender, and individual physiological traits may have shielded her from whatever force triggered the others' distress. Because sound waves influence people differently, it is possible that Sasha was the first to fall ill due to heightened sensitivity, perhaps as a result of his age and gender. As the oldest male in the group, he may have been more vulnerable to the frequency, setting off a chain reaction that ultimately led to the group's demise. With no definitive answers, speculation is all that remains of this tragedy. The case is officially closed, with authorities maintaining that hypothermia was the cause of death. However, for the friends and families of the 6 lost hikers, unsettling questions persist. Even after all these years, Val steadfastly refuses to discuss the horrifying events. When approached by reporters for an interview, she once responded sharply, "Do you think I want to relive this nightmare? I had to leave, changed my entire life. I don't want to remember it." The Holly Bobo case. A 20-year-old student woke up early to focus on her studies but mysteriously disappeared under highly unusual circumstances. From the start, investigators encountered strange and contradictory leads. Yet despite extensive search efforts, she remained missing for 3 years. Eventually, detectives made headway in the case, but each revelation only deepened the mystery. Her disappearance became one of the most perplexing cases in the state, and even after it was resolved, many unanswered questions remained. Holly Lynn Bobo was born on October 12, 1990, in the small American town of Darden, Tennessee. Darden was a quiet, close-knit community with only a few 100 residents, far removed from the hustle and bustle of major cities. Holly lived there with her parents and older brother, and the family enjoyed spending time outdoors, often going hiking, fishing, and swimming in the local creeks. Holly also had a deep love for singing and was actively involved in her church's services. After graduating high school, Holly set her sights on a career in healthcare, aspiring to become a nurse. She enrolled at the University of Tennessee's campus in a nearby town, and by 2011, at the age of 20, was devoting most of her time to her studies. She was also in a committed relationship, dating her high school sweetheart, and the couple was making exciting plans for their future together. Despite attending university, Holly still lived at home since the campus was only a short drive away. Her father had personally built their house, making it deeply meaningful to the family, so Holly had no immediate plans to move out. On the morning of April 13th, she woke up around 4:30 a.m. to prepare for class. A few hours later, her parents left for work while her brother remained asleep. At approximately 7:30 a.m., Holly's boyfriend called her to let her know he planned to go hunting on a large piece of land owned by her grandmother and wanted to confirm that her family wouldn't mind. They spoke for a few minutes, and Holly mentioned that she'd be heading to class soon. A short time later, one of Holly's neighbors stepped outside, preparing to get into his car, when he suddenly heard a sharp, chilling scream coming from the direction of her house. Concerned that something might have happened to a neighbor, he quickly informed his mother, who then called Holly's mom. Alarmed, Holly's mother attempted to call her daughter, but there was no answer. Growing increasingly worried, she decided to return home to check on her. Meanwhile, Holly's brother, who was still asleep at the time, hadn't heard the scream. However, shortly after, The family's dog in the backyard began barking loudly, prompting him to look outside. Peering through the window, he spotted Holly standing in the garage with a man beside her. He couldn't identify him because the man was dressed in camouflage, but his initial assumption was that it could be Holly's boyfriend, since he knew about his plans to go hunting on their mother's land, and that he often wore camouflage. The sight didn't immediately seem alarming. However, from where he stood, Holly's brother couldn't make out what they were saying, but he could tell from her tone that she appeared to be upset. He quickly called his mother to ask if Holly was planning to attend class that day, or if she had invited her boyfriend over instead. However, before he could finish, his mother cut him off, shouting that the man wasn't her boyfriend. Then, she said something unexpected. She told him to grab a gun and shoot the man immediately. Stunned, he asked if she was serious, and she firmly responded yes before abruptly hanging up. When he looked back out the window, he saw Holly walking toward the woods near their property, with the man in camouflage holding her hand. This time, he noticed that the man was significantly taller and broader than her boyfriend. Still struggling to process what was happening, he tried calling Holly, but she didn't answer. He also attempted to reach her boyfriend, but there was no response from him either. Meanwhile, their mother had already contacted the police. But because she was working in a neighboring county, her call was routed to a different station. Shortly after, her son called her back to inform her that Holly had walked into the woods with the unknown man. Realizing the urgency of the situation, he grabbed his gun and rushed outside. However, by the time he got there, Holly was nowhere to be seen. What he did notice, though, were splatters of blood inside the garage. Alarmed, he immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the house within minutes, but by then, there was no sign of Holly. Her brother showed them the blood in the garage and described the strange man he had seen. The only details he could provide were that the man was wearing camouflage and a cap, which obscured his face, making it difficult to identify him. Still, he remembered that the man had long, dark hair that reached down to his back. He also mentioned that he couldn't make out what Holly and the man were talking about, but he noticed the man had a fairly deep voice. The whole situation seemed strange to the police, but they didn't rush to start a full investigation. The local police department had very little experience handling cases like this, so they weren't sure what to do. In those critical first hours, they didn't search the woods, secure the house or the blood-stained garage, or even talk to the neighbors. When Holly's parents returned home, they quickly realized that the officers weren't putting in any real effort to find their daughter. After repeated pleas from the family to begin a proper investigation, officers finally organized a search of the woods, spoke with neighbors, and brought in forensic experts to examine the blood in the garage. They also confirmed that Holly's boyfriend couldn't have been the man she was seen with. Besides the fact that her brother had noted the man looked very different, the police verified that her boyfriend was out hunting at the time of her disappearance. The search in the woods turned up nothing, so investigators requested GPS data from Holly's phone. It showed her moving north for about 30 minutes before heading back in the opposite direction. The last signal came from a spot in the woods, just a few 100 yards from her house. After that, the phone seemed to have been turned off. Police went to search that area and soon found the phone. Its SIM card was removed, but there was no sign of Holly herself. The search continued for several days but led nowhere. Meanwhile, something strange started happening. People in their small town began finding Holly's belongings scattered around. First, someone found her lunch container on the street, then a receipt with her name on it. Another resident came across her school card. It was all pretty strange, but the police still couldn't figure out who was leaving these items. They considered that it might have been Holly herself, or maybe the person who took her. With no progress in finding Holly, investigators turned to the list of convicted criminals in the area. Soon, their attention shifted to a local man named Terry, who had multiple assault charges on his record. Digging deeper, they found that his victims shared striking similarities with Holly in both age and appearance. Terry also matched the height and build description of the man seen with Holly, so investigators began looking into his possible involvement in her disappearance. They obtained a warrant to search his home but found no evidence. Next, they set up a wiretap, monitoring his calls and conversations for several weeks. But they still couldn't uncover anything that connected him to Holly's case. The investigators continued looking into other suspects and kept expanding their search area. With each passing week, more and more volunteers joined the effort. But despite their combined efforts, the search operations brought no results. For the next several months, there was barely any progress in Holly's case. Eventually, the police called off the ground search, shifting their focus entirely to investigating potential suspects. But this didn't lead anywhere either. Holly's family was devastated. They had no clue what had happened to her, where she might be, or if she was even alive. They also blamed the local police department, feeling the authorities hadn't put in enough effort, especially in those crucial first days. Looking back, the family realized the police had taken almost no action in the first 72 hours, which are often critical in missing persons cases. Despite their frustration, complaints, and push for a more active investigation, Holly's fate remained unknown. This went on for 3 years until something unexpected happened. In March 2014, police arrested a local man named Dylan, known to authorities for his involvement with illegal substances, on charges of unlawful weapon possession. During his interrogation, he made an unexpected confession, claiming he had seen Holly after she was abducted. According to Dylan, on the day of Holly's disappearance, he had gone to his brother Zach's house to pick up a car. When he entered the living room, he saw his brother, their mutual friend Jason, and another person, Holly. She was sitting in a chair, looking terrified. Dylan claimed that Zach told him he had kidnapped Holly, assaulted her, and even filmed it. As for what happened afterward, Dylan said only that she was killed soon after the abduction, insisting he had no part in the murder. He also mentioned that his brother had been wearing camouflage that day. The police brought Zach and Jason in for questioning, but both denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance. Investigators also searched their homes for any evidence, or the alleged video of Holly's assault, but found nothing. Shortly after this, a woman contacted the police with another unexpected story. She claimed that she had previously lived with a man named Jeffrey, and one day, he had shown her a clip from a video where a man assaulted a young woman. Jeffrey told her that the woman in the video was Holly and that the man doing that was Zach. He also mentioned that the video had been recorded by his brother, Mark. Detectives met with this woman and asked if she'd be willing to call Jeffrey while they recorded the conversation. She agreed, and during the call, she brought up the video. From Jeffrey's responses, detectives felt certain he really had shown her the recording. Shortly after, Jeffrey and his brother were both arrested. During questioning, both denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance and claimed not to know anything about the video. When detectives played Jeffrey the recording of his conversation with the woman, he said he had probably misunderstood her question. He added that his ex-wife's name was also Holly, suggesting he might have misinterpreted what she. Police searched the brothers' homes and examined all their devices but were unable to find the video. They also found no evidence linking the brothers to the other 3 suspects. In the end, they had to release the brothers as the witness statement alone was not enough. However, as investigators continued trying to establish connections between these people and Zach, they uncovered another suspect. They found that a man named Shane had been in contact with Zach on the day of Holly's disappearance and decided to question him. They suspected that Zach might have asked him for help in disposing of the body. And during the interrogation, Shane confirmed that he indeed knew where Holly's remains were hidden. Detectives offered him full immunity in exchange for testifying against others involved and leading them to the body. Shane agreed, but for some reason, he was ultimately unable to locate Holly's remains. In the end, the investigators revoked the deal and began considering other ways to obtain confessions or some new evidence against these suspects. While investigators were pursuing this lead, they received an unexpected call. In September 2014, a group of men went hunting in a forest about 19 miles from Holly's home. One of them spotted a large bucket hidden in the brush and decided to take a look. When he turned it over, he found a human skull and immediately reported it to the police. Forensic experts arrived on the scene and collected partial remains, which they sent to the lab for identification. Right away, detectives suspected these might be Holly's, and dental records quickly confirmed it. The remains had been out in the woods for 3 years, so finding out exactly what happened was nearly impossible. But one thing was certain: a bullet hole in the skull confirmed she'd been shot. Now there was no question Holly's death was a homicide. With the case now officially classified as a murder, detectives zeroed in on their 4 main suspects. Zach, his brother Dylan, their friend Jason, and their acquaintance Shane. The detectives decided to focus on Jason and brought him in for questioning. At first, he kept denying any involvement. But when the police told him that he could face a life sentence for murder, Jason agreed to testify against Zach. According to Jason, on the day of Holly's disappearance, he went over to Zach's house to buy drugs. Along with Zach, his brother and Shane were also there. They told him they had killed Holly and now needed to get rid of the evidence. Zach then showed him Holly's body wrapped in a blanket lying in the trunk of his car. Zach asked Jason to help dispose of the body, and he agreed. While Shane burned Holly's belongings in a barrel, he and Zach drove to the Tennessee River Bridge to throw her into the water. But when they pulled her out of the trunk, Zach realized she was still alive and shot her. Fearing the gunshot might attract attention, Zach quickly changed his plan. He put Holly's body back in the car and drove off to find another hiding place, dropping Jason off along the way. Sometime later, when Zach reached out to Jason, he mentioned he'd hidden Holly's body in the woods. But as it turned out, the location he described wasn't where her remains were actually found. Jason's story about the abduction also raised some questions. According to him, Zach, his brother, and Shane initially went to Holly's brother's house to teach him how to produce illegal substances. There, they saw Holly and apparently mentioned their plans to her. She became outraged, yelling at them to leave. Worried she'd expose their illegal activities, the trio decided to abduct her. This version seemed odd for several reasons. First, Holly's brother claimed he had never been interested in making illegal substances and had never discussed it with any of the suspects. Second, when he woke up, he saw only one person with his sister, and that person didn't match Zach's description. The only one fitting what he remembered was Shane. Where the other 2 suspects were at that moment remained unclear. Jason also revealed that after abducting Holly, the 3 men took her to an old barn belonging to Shane's grandmother, where they assaulted her. It's worth mentioning that the check with Holly's name on it and her school card were found less than 100 yards from Shane's house. As for Zach and his brother, the police managed to find several pieces of circumstantial evidence linking them to the crime. Right after Holly's abduction, multiple neighbors reported seeing a white pickup speeding away from her house, and Zach owned a similar truck. His vehicle was also spotted by a surveillance camera near her home. Zach's ex-girlfriend told investigators that he had occasionally threatened her, saying something like, "I'll tie you up like Holly, and no one will ever see you again." Several other witnesses claimed that he had told them, directly or indirectly, about his involvement in Holly's disappearance. Police also learned that Zach had threatened his brother, warning him that he'd end up in the same hole next to her if he cooperated with the investigation. Detectives also learned from a local resident that after the murder, Shane and Zach offered him a gun in exchange for illegal substances, and he accepted the deal. He later threw the weapon into the water, where police eventually recovered it. However, there were no fingerprints or DNA on it, so experts couldn't link it to the crime. As the prosecution prepared for trial, gathering all the evidence, the case took yet another turn. Shane, who had initially agreed to cooperate with the police but then failed to lead them to Holly's remains, was found dead in a hotel room. Authorities concluded he had done it himself, though the exact reason remained unknown. His lawyer blamed the investigators, insisting they had threatened Shane with a long prison sentence. The suspects' trials were held separately, starting with Zach's. His trial began in September 2017, 6 years after Holly's murder. Though Zach pleaded not guilty, Jason's testimony, along with other pieces of circumstantial evidence, weighed heavily against him. After a few weeks, the jury found him guilty of murder, sentencing him to life in prison, along with 2 additional 25-year terms for kidnapping and assault. In January the following year, Dylan went to trial. He decided to take a plea deal, admitting to helping with the kidnapping and murder, though the deal didn't require him to testify against anyone else or provide any details. He was sentenced to 35 years with no chance of parole. As for Jason, due to his cooperation, he received an 8-year sentence with the opportunity for early release. So Holly's case was officially closed. But even after that, many questions remained. The prosecution lacked a single solid piece of evidence directly linking the suspects to her kidnapping. No fingerprints, DNA, or other evidence was ever found that Holly had been in Zach's car or home. The suspects' families and defense insisted that the entire case was built on a fabrication. They claimed police first coerced Dylan into making a false statement, and later did the same with Jason, threatening him with prison time if he refused. Dylan and Jason's stories also didn't fully align. Initially, Dylan claimed he had gone to his brother's house that day to pick up a car and saw Holly and Jason there. But Jason stated he arrived after they'd already put Holly's body in the trunk and even alleged that Dylan had been directly involved in the abduction. There was also another questionable detail. According to investigators, the person who led Holly into the woods was likely Shane, as he was the only one whose height and build matched her brother's description. However, Shane had short, light hair, while Holly's brother recalled seeing a man with long, dark hair. A former Tennessee Bureau of Investigation officer, who worked on the case in its early stages, shared a few more curious insights. He mentioned that they requested cell tower data to track the location of each suspect's phone, but none of them appear to be near. However, since cell tower data only provides a rough estimate within a relatively large area, it wasn't definitive. The investigators also revealed that they found a palm print on Holly's car that didn't match hers, her family's, or any of her friends. They compared it to all the suspects as well, but none of them matched either. Yet, there was no certainty that this print was even relevant to the case. Zach's attorney argued that a much more likely suspect was a man named Terry, whom police investigated during the initial months. As we recall, they questioned him, searched his house, and even placed a wiretap on him, but found no evidence to confirm his involvement. Terry's wife claimed she was home with him that morning while he was installing a new bathtub, but the defense attorney argued that her alibi might have been inaccurate. He said that she was actually at work that morning and that Terry had called her there. When investigators checked with the store where he supposedly bought the tub, they couldn't confirm the sale. Adding to suspicions, right after Holly's disappearance, Terry cut off his long, dark hair. According to the attorney, not only could Terry's wife have faked an alibi for him, but she might have even helped him commit his crimes. Terry had several convictions for assaults on other women, and in some cases, his wife allegedly helped him. Lastly, forensic experts couldn't completely rule out a match between Terry's palm print and the one found on Holly's car. While they could confidently rule out everyone else, they couldn't do the same for Terry. Despite all of this, the prosecution remained firm, insisting that the suspect's guilt was proven beyond doubt, with too many circumstantial factors pointing to their involvement. Jason served only 3 years before being released early. But just a few months later, he was arrested again on weapons charges, putting him back behind bars to await trial. Then, at the beginning of 2024, Jason made an unexpected statement. He claimed that his previous testimony had been fabricated, and he never actually saw Holly that day. According to him, he had fabricated the entire story to avoid a life sentence, making a deal with the police based on false claims. Following this, Zach filed a motion for a new trial, but in late September 2024, it was denied. The judge determined that Jason's retraction alone was not enough to overturn the conviction, as there were still other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Zach. Notably, at the time Jason withdrew his testimony, he was still awaiting trial for his weapons charges. About a month before the judge ruled on Zach's appeal, Jason was sentenced to 19 years in prison. This timing raises suspicions about his motives. His sudden change of story may have been an attempt to influence his own case or reduce his sentence. As things stand, all 3 men remain incarcerated, and their only real chance at a retrial depends on whether their lawyers can uncover new evidence that either proves their innocence or identifies another suspect. So far, however, no progress has been made in that regard, and the prosecution remains firm in its stance that all 3 are undeniably guilty. Let us know your thoughts on this case in the comments. Moving on to the next case. The disappearance of Gretchen Harrington. Advancements in forensic technology and cold case resolutions. With the dedication of organizations like the DNA Doe Project, continuous advancements in forensic science, and the increasing use of genealogy websites, more decades-old cold cases are finally being solved. In 2022, one of the most well-known unidentified cases in the U.S. reached a breakthrough when Joseph Sorelli, formerly known as the Boy in the Box, was identified. While the exact details surrounding his death remain unknown, cases like his suggest that answers in long-standing mysteries may not be as elusive as they once were. The disappearance of Gretchen Harrington. On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington left her home to attend summer Bible school. Living in Brummel, Pennsylvania, she was on her way to Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church, located less than half a mile from her house. However, somewhere along her route, she vanished. Gretchen never made it to Bible school. Her father, who was a pastor at another church location, was friends with David Zanstra, the pastor of the church Gretchen was supposed to attend that morning. After several hours with no sign of her, Gretchen's father was informed of her disappearance and asked Zanstra to contact the authorities, which he did. An extensive search for the 8-year-old soon began, but no sign of her was found. Just short of 2 months later, on October 14th, skeletal remains were discovered in Ridley Creek State Park, not far from where Gretchen went missing. The remains were soon identified as belonging to the 8-year-old, with the cause of death being determined as injuries to the skull. The case was ruled a homicide and an investigation began, but it grew cold before long. In 2023, almost 48 years after Gretchen's murder in 1975, an arrest was finally made in her case. On July 24th, the Delaware County DA's office announced that 83-year-old David Zanstra had been charged with criminal homicide of the first, second, and third degree, as well as kidnapping of a minor and possession of an instrument of crime. The break in the case came just 1 week earlier when investigators decided to re-interview Zanstra. The pastor of the church Gretchen was attending on the day of her disappearance. Chillingly, not only was Zanstra a devoted family friend, but one of his daughters was Gretchen's closest companion. Police noted that during their 2023 interview with him, he initially denied being involved. However, when he was confronted with evidence of sexual misconduct in the past, he broke down, telling detectives that he'd seen the little girl walking alone on the road on the morning that she went missing. Zanstra claimed that he offered Gretchen a lift to the church, which she accepted because she knew and trusted him. Instead, he took her to a nearby wooded area where he parked the car and asked her to remove her clothing. The 8-year-old refused, however, much to his anger. He struck Gretchen with his fist, leaving her bleeding. Believing she was dead, he covered up her body and fled the scene. Jack Stolzheimer labeled Zanstra as a monster, stating, "This is a man who was a remorseless child predator who acted as if he was a friend, a neighbor, and a man of God, and he killed this poor little girl." He added that Zanstra played the part of a family friend for years after Gretchen's death. Investigators had decided to revisit Zanstra when, in the autumn of 2022, a woman came forward wishing to speak to somebody about Gretchen's case. When connected with an officer, the woman stated that she thought she knew who the killer was. Remarkably, she had diaries she'd kept from the 1970s in which she'd written down some of this information. She had been just 10 at the time of the murder and lived in Havertone, around 3 miles east of where Gretchen went missing. This woman had, as a child, also been friends with one of Zanstra's daughters. She recalled sleeping over at their house frequently, and told police that one time she awoke in the middle of the night to find Zanstra molesting her. When she moved, he hurriedly exited the room, but he came back the next night to do it again. When she asked her friend, Zanstra's daughter, about his actions, she replied, "He does that sometimes." When she got home, she told her parents about the incident. They immediately forbade her from sleeping over at the pastor's house. In her diaries, the woman also wrote about an abduction involving a friend of hers named Holly. She wrote, "Guess what? A man tried to kidnap Holly twice. Suspicion falls on Pastor Zanstra. It's a secret, so I can't tell anyone, but I believe he might be the one who kidnapped Gretchen. I think it was Mr. Z." On the day Gretchen went missing, Witnesses reported seeing her speaking with a man inside a car. Some accounts even suggested that the vehicle resembled one owned by Zanstra. Despite these observations, investigators at the time were unable to establish a solid link between the pastor and the crime. When Zanstra was arrested in 2023, DNA samples were collected and will be analyzed to determine if they match any unsolved cases. Authorities have also voiced concerns that, due to his position as a pastor, Zanstra may have been involved in the abuse of other children.